to another episode of the Sfarim Cheddar podcast, and I'm Nachi Weinstein. The guest on this episode is Professor Gershon David Hundert A'H, one of the foremost experts on Eastern European Jews, especially the Jews of Poland in the 18th century, who recently passed away a little over a week ago. Professor Hundert authored a number of books, including Jews in Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century, The Jews in a Polish Private Town, the case of Apatow in the 18th century, and he was also the editor-in-chief of the massive YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, which is 2 volumes and also available online for free, as well as authoring numerous articles and editing various books. Professor Hundert recently edited Dov Ber Birkenthal, or Ber of Bolechów, memoirs, and Divrei Bina, which is a history of Shabtai Tzvi and the Frankist movement, especially Ber's role in the 1759 disputation in Lvov, Lemberg, with the Frankists that he relays in Divrei Bina. This episode was recorded a number of months ago after the new edition came out in May, and I'm releasing it now in memory of Professor Hundert, who, like I said, just passed away a little more than a week ago. And if you're interested in Polish and Eastern European Jewry, I highly recommend his works, which I'll put links to in the show's notes to all of his works, and as well as this new one that we discussed in the episode. This episode is sponsored by Mosaica Press. Check out their new titles at your local Judaica store or mosaicapress.com, especially Dimensions in Chumash, a 2-volume set by Rabbi Emanuel Bernstein, who was just on the Sfarim Cheddar podcast, which takes key topics and episodes from the Chumash and, based on a vast array of famous commentators, guides readers to a new level of understanding, illumination, and inspiration. Additionally, someone that I know, Sruly Tress, has undertaken to republish and redo a momentous work that delves deeply into the fiery controversy surrounding machine-made matzoh in 1850s Galicia, Poland. This painstaking endeavor includes the meticulous recreation annotation of treasured kuntresim, complemented by a number of supplementary materials and subsequent writings that further illuminate the subject matter. These include such Rabbonim as the Rov of Brody, Reb Shlomo Kluger, the Rav Yosef Shaul Nathanson, who is the Shoel Uneishiv, Rebbes of Ger, Tzanz, and many others. He's trying to crowdfund the remaining money needed to publish this work, and I'll include a link in the show's notes. Also, I have a sample of where they're right now. I don't know. I think they're close to being finished, but not totally finished yet. So if you would like the sample, you can email me. I'll post it in the show's notes as well. And all donations above $2,600 will get a full Seichel Nishmas page in the Sefer. And just to reiterate, I'm not personally affiliated with this project. So any specific questions you want, email him at sfarimredone@gmail.com, SEFORIMREDONE@gmail.com. And I'll put a link in the show's notes if you want to give money towards that. Crowdfunding Sfarim is something that was mentioned on the podcast live in Prague here on the podcast, and also recently was there was a project headed by Dov Ber about the Rabbonim Minsker and the Enes Elam, which was discussed in my recent Mishpacha article that I did with Yehuda Geber and Dov Ber. To sponsor an episode or support the podcast, please email me at sfarimchatter@gmail.com or see the links and information in the show's notes. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, and enjoy the podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Cheddar podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Gershon David Hundert, who is the Leonor Siegel Professor of Jewish Studies and Professor of History at McGill University in Montreal. And we will be discussing Dov Ber Birkenthal, or Ber of Bolechów, I think he's from, and his works, his history kind of chronicle or a history work, which is titled Divrei Bina, and also Zechroinus, his remembrances, kind of his autobiography account. And Divrei Bina is a lot of very interesting. This is a the 18th century mainly he lived in, and this is a lot of the history of the Frankist movement. It talks about Shabtai Tzvi, and there's a lot of other really interesting things in there as well. And Professor Hundert has just published a new complete edition from the Hebrew manuscript with notes, published through Mossad Bialik in their Dorot series in 2 volumes. So we'll be discussing Ber and his life and this work. So thank you, Professor Hundert, for joining me.
My pleasure.
So let's start off with, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm from Toronto, but I've been in McGill for a very long time. And my interest started out in Chassidut when I did my master's essay. But someone said to me, you should know something about the social and economic and political background, and I'm still doing that.
Yeah, it's a lot of your prior books on Poland and the Commonwealth, etc. So let's, I guess, how did you become interested in Divrei Bina and Birkenthal?
Well, it's everyone who's interested in Eastern Europe and Jewish history in Eastern Europe knows the earlier publications regarding his writings or transmitting his writing, parts of his writings. But I was in a group at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem on Chassidut. I was the historian in the group. Everybody else was Hasidism person. And I had just finished this massive project, an encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe that's online, and you can find it. It's called the Evo Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe. I just finished that, and I was embarking on a new project. It was going to be about Uman, beginning with the pogrom, and then Rabbi Nachman comes to Uman, and then supposedly the first modern Jewish school in Russia was created in Uman. And then I was going to have my son write a last chapter about going to Uman every Rosh Hashanah. But as I was reading the materials that were published by Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish scholars, court records, and all kinds of published sources that I could have access to, I found a reference to an attack on the town of Bolechów, or Bolechów, by some bandits who the Soviets, especially the Marxists, wanted to identify with the Ukrainian national movement. And there were lots of details about the leader of the band and what happened and what they did and how they captured them. And they were being tried by the Russian authorities. And I remembered that in the published version of Dov Ber Birkenthal's memoirs, there's an account of this attack. And so I compared the two accounts, and found that they worked. He tells how one Jew had a gun in each hand and he was shooting at them, and he wounded the leader. And sure enough, in the testimony in the court that's published in Polish, if I remember right, they say the leader was wounded by a Jew who was firing. It all sort of matched up. So I rushed out an article too fast because I found more sources about this attack. But at that point, I became intrigued with the Dov Ber, and I looked again at the published version of the memoirs. And in a footnote, they're published by Wishnitzer. In a footnote, he says, 2 people published little bits of this before me. So you see that and you say, well, I have the whole thing here. I don't have to. So I went and checked. And it turns out there were 2 versions of the memoirs. And he had published only one for reasons that I have no understanding. I don't know why. But in the meantime, I also remembered that the manuscript of Dov Ber's other book, called Divrei Bina, as you mentioned, was held about 50 yards from where I was sitting in my office at the Institute in Jerusalem. So I went to look at the manuscript of Divrei Bina, a little bit of which had been published by somebody called Avram Yaakov Braver at the time of the First World War. And I began reading, and the introduction to Divrei Bina is an astounding documents, about 40 pages, and it's an introduction to his times. And along the way, he mentions a person called Israel Baal Shem. So I came back to my Hasidism group and announced that I had found a contemporary reference to Israel Baal Shem that none of them knew about, and he doesn't like them very much. I published some of that as well, also prematurely. I shouldn't have jumped to publish it. I published a little article. And from that point, I was sort of captured. And I wanted to find a second version of the memoirs, so-called. We don't have the title page of that book. We do not know what Birkenthal called it or what he thought he was doing. So the historians have attached the word memoirs, the title memoirs, to that. It is a sort of memoir, but it doesn't conform to any literary genre of autobiography or memoir that we know about. In any case, so he mentions these 2 guys. One is called Levin, a scholar who worked mostly on the Council of 4 Lands. And his archive is at Yeshiva University. So I went there to look at his archive. And it was filled with manuscripts that he had, let's say, found in Eastern Europe in various places. But it didn't have what I was looking for. And the other scholar was somebody called Marmerstein, who taught at Jews College in England. And he had bequeathed his library. You know, nowadays with the internet, you can find out almost anything. So I found that he had bequeathed his library to the John Rylands Library in Manchester University. And I looked at the collection, I wrote to them, and they said they have only books, no manuscripts. And then, whatever we want to call it, fate stepped in. And I was talking to a colleague of mine who taught in England, and she said she had a friend who was friends with the anicle of this Marmerstein, who was a Satmar Chassid. So I called him on the phone, and I said, do you have any manuscripts from your Zayda? Since he was a Satmar, I said, Zayda. And he said, no, everything went to Manchester. They said they have only books. He says, they don't know what they have. So, so at that point, I just looked at the Manchester University list of professors, and I found somebody who taught Jewish studies who I didn't know, and I asked them to have a look, see what's going on. And a few weeks later, I got an apologetic letter from the librarian. They had found a box. And the box had not been opened since the 1950s, and they couldn't just open it. They had to do all kinds of things with it. But eventually, he wrote to me that he opened the box. He doesn't know Hebrew, but there's a file folder that says in English, the memoirs of Dov Ber, of Bolechów. And so I took myself to Manchester, and I opened it up. And sure enough, here's the second version with lots of material that Vishnitzer had not published. There used to be in Chicago a holiday called Pulaski Day in honor of a Polish fighter in the American Revolution. And it turns out that this so-called, he's not really a general, but Pulaski came for lunch at Birkenthal's house in Bolechów. Birkenthal was, I suppose, lucky. It turned out to be Purim, so his wife had prepared all kinds of fish for the Purim Suda. And so they served it to Pulaski and his officers, and lots of other things that had not been seen before. So that's how I got hooked into Birkenthal, and I decided I was going to do a proper editing of both books that he wrote, and that's what I occupied myself with for a very, very long time, and it finally got published about a week ago.
Yeah, how many years were you working on this? Was it like an on and off project?
Well, it was, it was up at least a dozen years. It's possible it's more. I did other things in the meantime. I published a couple of articles about him in the meantime, but it took a very, very long time because it's complicated. First I had the two versions to compare, they overlap. So I had to compare and get them. And Vishnitzer, when he published the memoirs that he had, got the little fascicles in the wrong order. There are about 9 fascicles, and he laid them out wrong. So that the order of the sections makes no sense. And the first review of that book in 1925 in the Monat Schrift points out he got the order wrong. He had messed up the whole. So all of that took a very long time just to get things in order. And then I had to, there are all kinds of translations there from German and from Polish, as well as, of course, citations from all of the canon that had to be tracked down and had to be checked. When he's translating from Polish or German, he frequently Judaizes the text. So the Christmas, Easter, and New Year's become the regalim and that kind of thing. And you have to find it. You have to compare what he's doing with the original text. So all of that took a very, very long time, aside from the fact that I had undertaken to do the whole thing in Hebrew, which it turned out that my abilities exceeded what I thought they were when I started the project. It took a while to get the syntax right and all of that. But it's finally done, and I'm feeling very glad to have it off my desk.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating work. What I came across it reading Professor Pavel Macheko's book, The Mixed Multitude, on the Frankist movement. He uses it, he quotes it extensively, and it comes up because as we'll discuss here. I told you this before the podcast. I should say it here. A very interesting story of like Hashgacha. I thought I got the two volumes, and I was reading it. I actually took it to shul. On Shabbos, interesting enough, with some other sefer. Funny enough, I had it on top of a sefer, and my neighbor came over and took it off. And I said, by the way, there's Torah in here. I showed him like there's not only stories. He quotes a lot of sources in here as well. And so, but interestingly, the story I was going to say was that I took it at one point together with another sefer, Lechem Yehuda, that Avat Shalom just reprinted for the first time in 500 years. It's a commentary on Pirkei Avos, Reb Yehuda Lirma. Now, actually, a very interesting story that he printed it, and then it was burned in 1553. And then he says in there that he had no copies left. He started rewriting it from memory. He had printed 1,500 copies, and then he rewrote it from memory. And then when he got up to the third parak, he found one non-Jew had it, and he bought it for a lot of money, and he ended up found it, and he redid it anyways, and he reprinted it. I think there's one copy now of the original. I think there's one, maybe more. It's in Oxford. We have both. So Avat Shalom finally reprinted this work. It's recently, beautiful job. And Birkenthal here is talking about why he decided to do this, and in his introduction, he's explaining himself why he does it, and he wanted to learn Polish and other languages, etc. And then he wasn't sure if he should do it or not. And he says, Ad shegil yadi sefer lechem Yehuda shechibar chacham akadman Rav Yehuda ben Reb Shmuel Lirma Sfardizan. He brings a whole long introduction on his commentary on Avos and Eliezer. And it's very interesting that when I saw that, I was like, look at that! I have two brand new books printed within very short time span. I thought that was interesting. Okay, so let's just talk about this is not you've written extensively on this. It's not a podcast on the history of the times of the Jews and the Polish Commonwealth, but Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth at the time. But if you could just give like an overview, like I said, Birkenthal was really 18th century person. But before we get to Birkenthal, like what was going on in Poland at the time where he was and the Jews' situation, just to put the work in context.
Okay, so Poland was a large state that was in decline in the 18th century. There was increasing foreign interference by especially the Russians, but also the Prussians and the Austrians. And the state eventually ends up, as you know, getting carved up by its neighbors, and it disappears in the partitions at the end of the 18th century and doesn't reappear till after the First World War as an independent country. What distinguished Poland was the role of the nobility in governing the country. They in Western Europe, the social studies books used to talk about the age of absolutism and then eventually the French Revolution. Power flows away from the nobility and into the center, to the king, and eventually to the bourgeoisie cuts off the king's head. In Poland, that never happened. You have a decentralized situation where the political power of the gentry as a whole is balanced by the political power of the king, which is also balanced by the political power of about a dozen very powerful aristocrats. So you have a situation of stasis, where each one stops the other from reforming the political order. So for Jews, that creates a situation where they are allied partly with the king, as they always had been, and that's the normal Jewish foreign policy in Europe. But they're also allied with these powerful noblemen who own huge estates, have private armies, and so on. And a lot of the places where they live are private towns, that is, towns owned by these powerful noblemen, lock, stock, and barrel. Like Bolechów. Bolechów was a private town, and there were hundreds of them. The thing to know about Jews in Poland is that there is a community of astounding size. They make up somewhere between 4 and 6% of the population, but that's not the number that tells you anything. You have to remember that in the 18th century, 90-something% of the population of Poland, Lithuania were peasants living in the countryside. So the urban population is very small. So Jews make up roughly half of the urban population of Poland. And even more as you move east. That is, the eastern half of Poland, Lithuania, the towns are dominated by Jews. And we're talking about a community in 1765 of 750,000 Jews, which is by far the largest national community of Jews anywhere, 10 times the number that lived in what would be the German Empire at the time, 10 times. So this is a very large community, and Jews lived their lives very much, the dailiness of their lives, in a Jewish context. They spoke Yiddish, they related to other Jews, the rhythm of the day, the week, the year, followed the Jewish customs and practices. So it was very much a rich Jewish culture that, and Jews felt a kind of at homeness there. I think that was different from other countries. You could, in some ways, compare it to Spain in the Middle Ages, but it would get very complicated if you tried to extend that very far. In any case, there's a sense of at homeness, and the legends they told that you probably know reflect this. That Pauline is God telling Jews to dwell there. Pauline is the Hebrew word for Poland. Agnon, of course, turns that story around and makes it into a prayer where the Jews in Poland pray to God. Pauline, stay with us. Jews called Poland Polania. Here dwells the Lord. That kind of thing, and they had a sense of having been there a very long time and being a permanent part of the landscape, and their neighbors shared that idea about them. Jews were just part of the deal in Poland. That I think that'll do.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, just a general overview. Like I said, you've written elsewhere. You could direct listeners to your other books, but this is about. Yeah, we can talk about that at the end, reference some books. But this is about Dov Ber and his Divrei Bina and his memoirs. Okay, so let's talk about him. And we mentioned his name is Dov Ber Birkenthal, and he's Bolechów. What's his basic biography, his background?
Okay, he's born in 1723, dies in 1805. So his lifetime encompasses some very significant events in the course of the 18th century, and he is his claim to fame historically is that he says that he translated for Rabbi Chaim Rappaport, who had to answer the Frankist charge that Jews use Christian blood in their rituals, and that is commanded in their literature, including the Shulchan Aruch. That's there. And Rappaport had to answer, and Birkenthal knew Polish and German and some other languages, and he says that he served as the translator for Chaim Rappaport. Did he? I don't know, but he provides an extensive detail, partly based on Polish records of the disputation, which went on for months. He's only there the last couple of weeks for the last question, the key question about the bloodline. And he translates from Polish and a little bit from Latin. But he also adds his own eyewitness accounts of, for example, trying to bribe churchmen to stop this terrible disputation that Polish Jews thought was so threatening. So that's his claim to fame. He is the son of a prosperous wine merchant who also knows European languages and has ties to high noblemen. And eventually he goes into the wine business himself, and travels every year for about 20 or 25 years to Hungary to buy wine and bring it back and sell it to noblemen and clergymen and other prosperous people. And he does very well. He's very proud of himself. He lives a secure life. He himself never faced any kind of physical threat. His town is attacked by bandits, but he's not there at the time. Only his wife is there. She survives okay, but he loses his books, he says, or some of them, but some his maid saved for him, so they were rescued. He apparently, according to a letter we have from Gvir, a Jewish leader in Lviv, who Birkenthal sent a copy of Divrei Bina to make sure that he had told the story right. This Gvir says, I remember that Rabbi Rappaport asked you to record what had happened. So apparently the demand of Rabbi Rappaport is at the root of why he chose to write Divrei Bina, which is devoted a lot of it to full account and repetitious account of the Frankist debacle.
Yeah, and we'll get more. We can get more into that because he really recounts incomplete, and he goes through Shapsei Tzvi, where, as you mentioned, he gets a lot of it from the Tzizis Novel Tzvi or Kitzer Tzizis Novel Tzvi of Rabbi Yaakov Sasportis. But and we'll get more into the disputation of Chaim HaKohen Rappaport of Lvov, Lemberg. We have his Chuvas, Shalos for Chuvas, have been redone. I don't think they're available anymore, but it was redone beautifully a couple of years ago. Chuvas from Chaim HaKohen Rappaport. So a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned he lived his whole life in Bolechów. He lived in Lvov. Where did he live, Ber?
Well, his home was in Bolechów, but his business was in Lviv. And he rented a wine cellar from some monks, Carmelite monks, just at the wall of the city, at the entrance, which is the entrance to the Jewish quarter, in the old Jewish quarter in the city of Lviv, inside the walls. And that's where he did his business. I found a rental agreement for another place, so he branched out a little bit, but basically that's where he conducted his affairs.
Just one main question on his business, but we'll get the other parts are more interesting, I think, probably for listeners. And in his memoirs, Aquinas, he does discuss a lot of the business, and if you're those interested in reading about the wine liquor business in the 18th century. But what does that mean? What was his day-to-day job? What did that mean? He was a wine merchant exactly.
Well, he would travel to Hungary, and he would purchase 120 barrels, big, really substantial barrels of wine, mostly of pretty good quality. And then he would hire wagons and wagoners drawn by oxen to go back through the Carpathians to Lviv to sell this wine. I followed his route when I was in Lviv in the archive. I followed his route to Tokaj and to that region, the Hungarian wine growing region. It was a tough sled, especially if you have many, many wagons with these barrels. You had to have an armed guard, and the roads had to be relatively dry. He tells one story that I like a lot, where the roads were muddy, the bridges were out, and so he was delayed, and his drivers all got drunk passing the time, and one of them embraced him in the way that drunk people embrace you, and he smelled on the guy's breath that he had drunk some really good wine, and so he asked him where he got it, and he went and bought some because it was a bargain. So he was a feinschmecker when it came to wine. He knew his wines. He didn't have any problem tasting this wine. He doesn't seem to hesitate. He even makes fun of a guy who's worried about dealing in only kosher wine. He's not too concerned about that. I don't think that if someone gives him some kosher wine, he says, now I'll have good wine for Kiddush and Havdalah. Presumably, huh?
I was going to say, it's interesting about the guy in Nesach. I mean, he doesn't really go into it at all.
It doesn't seem to bother him. Well, you know better than me. I mean, there are all kinds of various approaches to that problem. And he's Mekil when it comes to that. So that's what he did. And so the main selling market was something called a contracts fair in January, when a couple of thousand noblemen would gather in Lviv. And that was a huge market for his wine. So he tried to go in the early fall, buy up the wine, get back in time for the contracts fair, and then he would sell. That was his main season. He sold during the year as well from time to time, but the main thing was this contracts fair in January. And, he had time. I mean, we have to remember when we're talking about the 18th century, there's not even street lighting, right? I mean, the day ends when the sun sets. Unless it's a fair day or a market day, nothing happens, and there's no disturbance. So that means that, on quiet days, nothing impinges on your time, and you can study, you can read, you can write. There are very few distractions. So I suspect that that's what he did. He is well read. He reads in Polish. He reads in German. He reads, the canonical text. He at one point he goes on about the Maharsha and how wonderful a scholar he was. But he had a pretty extensive library. He quotes from, the way you wrote history before Gibbon was you put together other people's histories, and he follows that fashion in making his history books. So he quotes extensively from existing works, both in European languages and in Hebrew. In one case in Yiddish, but he writes it in Hebrew without telling us that he's translating. That's the Sheris Yisrael. That's sort of a continuation of Josephus. So he had an extensive. He quotes from Chizuk Emunah without saying that Isaac of Troki was a Karaite. He doesn't know, because I found out that one of the major sort of groups of manuscripts of Chizuk Emunah, all reference to Karaism is erased from that stream of collection of manuscripts. So there's no reason that he should have known that he was a Karaite necessarily. In any case, he doesn't mention Karaites.
Yeah, and I found that interesting where he mentions a Rav Yitzchak Troki, and who's that for the listeners, that's a famous work that was used by everybody, not, even though he was a Karaite, about the anti-Christian work that was heavily used, but he calls him like Rav Yitzchak Troki. Obviously he didn't know, as you mentioned in the footnote in the Sefer, I saw that in the work, in the book, that he didn't realize that. Now, so what's unique about him, for a lot of things, but one thing that really comes to mind here, and I want to ask you about is, he's obviously a learned person, as you just mentioned. At night they would read, but he obviously learned about a lot of languages. We can get into that, but he is a wine merchant. I mean, that's what he does. He's clear that's what he does. Right. But then he writes this history work where it's kind of memoirs and it's historical, kind of chronicle. How unique is that? I mean, just in general for a Jewish person or anyone at the time, a wine merchant, he's writing this kind of chronicle. I mean, I think we don't have a lot of chronicles altogether from the time, do we?
No. It's very unusual. I mean, the first thing is he's, as you say, he's a layperson. He's not a Rav. And for me, that makes it very, very rich, because he doesn't feel obliged to be prescriptive and to be normative and to worry about all kinds of things that a rabbi would worry about when he writes. But we don't have urban memoirs from Poland, full stop, from this period. We have a couple from the 17th century, mostly by doctors and such, Poles. But in the 18th century, we have virtually nothing. I mean, noblemen wrote all kinds of things. We have diaries and autobiographies and whatnot, but they're in a different universe. There are a couple of things that are roughly analogous. There's somebody called Moshe Wasserzug, who lived in with the western part of Poland, who wrote a brief memoir. He was a businessman. There's Isaac Aaron, I think his name is. He lived in Sweden. He claims to have been the first Jew to live in Sweden. He was a seal engraver. People sign their letters, they stamp their letters into the wax with seals. He would make the seals. But these things are not nearly as rich as what Birkenthal wrote. We have Yesh Manchilin by a rabbi from somewhat further west than Poland, which by his name, he was a member of the Katzenellenbogen family. And part of that is, and it's interesting because he's sort of a naive character. He's not a great scholar like some of his relatives. So he's pretty naive, and you get some information about life as he lived it. But again, it's imbued with his rabbinical consciousness. So this is a very precious document for Jewish history and for Polish history in this period.
Right, and it's a very interesting work to read. So why does he say he decides to write this? I mean, his memoirs we can do, like you said, there's no introduction there, and it's memoirs. Okay, people write memoirs, but why a history, kind of a chronicle, history work? Why does he decide to do that?
Look, the Rebbe, I think, can be put in some ways, can be put in the category of Sifrei Vikuach, as going back to polemical literature of Jews against, in defense of themselves or against Christianity. He's obsessed to show that the Christians are wrong about Judaism, that he defends the oral Torah at great length, and he shows the absurdities of Christianity to his satisfaction. And part of that, of course, is from his experience with the Frankists and the whole sponsorship of the Church of the Frankists and their conversion. But part of it is, I think, something that's going on in 18th century Jewish life from, Prague eastward, which is that they're beginning to look at Christianity in a somewhat different way. That is, the threat is not just a physical threat, or limitations, expulsion, persecution, but it is a genuine theological threat. That is, I think in the 18th century, East European Jews and some Central European Jews are beginning to see Christianity as a genuine ideological, theological problem, and that has to be taken seriously. And I think that's a change, and I think that's reflected here. I can't prove that. This is a hypothesis, right? But I think that that's part of what's going on. And Divrei Binah does a lot of things at the same time. He says he doesn't want later generations to think that they had it good. He wants to tell them about some terrible things that happened, mainly the Frankists, but also he mentions a couple of blood libels elsewhere, and some other problems. He mentions very briefly attacks in Ukraine by Cossacks. But I think that the primary motivation, and he says this, he wanted to refute the ideas of the church.
Yeah, and that read the introduction. I read, in the beginning introduction right away. He's very, very busy, going back way back. He starts all the way back. Yeah. He's very busy with this, and that's where he says, before I got to Lechem Yehuda part, he's explaining he decided he's going to learn the other languages, and that's something we should mention here. So we've mentioned that a couple times. He knew Polish, he knew some Latin, he knew some other languages, he knew German. How common is it for a Jew of any sort, whether it's rabbinic or like his, like a lay person, to know other languages other than Yiddish and Hebrew at the time? How unique is this?
It's unusual, but very far from unique. That is, Rabbi Rappaport himself knew Polish and had a Latin Bible in his library. But he felt that his Polish wasn't good enough for participating in this debate. But he did know. He says he quotes him as saying that he knew Polish, and lots of other people did, but certainly the majority did not, at least to read and to write. They may, I think, a substantial number knew how to speak Polish because they had to interact in the marketplace. But reading and writing is a different order of things, and that was unusual, but as I said, not unique. We keep growing the list of people we know who were quite had a lot of facility in Polish. And he says it was his father who hired a tutor to teach him Polish. Why did his father hire a tutor to teach him Polish? Too many T's there. I think it's for business reasons, but he never says that it was good for me for business to be able to talk to these noblemen properly in Polish and sell my wine to them. But certainly that's somewhere there in the discussion. And then he talks a lot to the merchants of Lviv, non-Jewish merchants, who are upstanding, citizens like him. And they tell him if he really wants to understand the world and what's going on, he has to learn German. So he learns German. He trades off with a young clerk. He teaches the clerk Hebrew, and the clerk teaches him German.
And
so he wants to know about the world, and of course that opens things up to him in ways that are quite remarkable.
now, when you went through and did your work reading Dov Ber, I mean, you can see that he really was using these other Polish, German, etc., other sources.
Oh yeah, well he translates extensive sections of his book from Polish and from German, and I had the German and Polish books in front of me, and he was translating properly, except when he came to something that he found offensive, in which case he would kind of Judaize the text a little bit so it wouldn't bother anybody, or he says, I won't write this down, it's not worth the ink to write this quote, this sentence that extols Christianity or some church father or something like that. But yes, he really did know those languages. His translation is fine, as near as I can tell.
So he knew Hebrew, Yiddish, I guess German, Polish, some Latin?
Yeah, and I assume he knew Hungarian, though he never says so, because it's pretty hard to get around Hungary without some Hungarian.
Okay, so let's discuss the overall Dov Ber. You mentioned the introduction. So the structure of the work, you said it's a polemic, but what's the overall kind of structure of the different parts that
Well, he presents it. He's going to tell a history of false messiahs, right? That's how he presents it. But of course, he runs by all the false messiahs in quotation marks before Shabtai Tzvi. Then he quotes, I don't know, 100 and something pages from Tzitzit Novel Tzvi, which is the summary of Jacob Sasportas' more extensive work of the same title. He uses Emden's edition without ever mentioning Emden. I think one of the interesting things that we kind of sideline is he never mentions Yaakov Emden, whereas we know that was a very big issue. The Emden-Eibish's feud was a very big issue at the time. We have a report from the Chida, Azulai, in Amsterdam, meets a Jew from Bolechów who had to leave town because he was on the wrong side of the Emden-Eibish's dispute. So Birkenthal certainly knew about this, but he chose not. One of the great frustrations of this exercise that I've been engaged in is trying to make sure that I don't write about what he doesn't mention. Because, you can't make a case. But one of the things that's not there is Emden-Eibish's, and even when he's quoting Emden and quoting, Emden's little interpolations of his own in his publication of Kitzur Tzitzat Novel Tzvi, he just quotes it verbatim without acknowledging that those are Emden's words. He just runs right by it. So he's writing history in the way that history was written, that he knew. The books that he had written is a little out of date compared to Western Europe, because real history, there's some modern historical scholarship, is beginning with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and Hume and some others are inventing history. But he's before that. And he's certainly before Rousseau. He's not autobiography. You can't compare him to Solomon Maimon, for example. Maimon knew about autobiography and knew what that was. And we have a child who grows into a man. We don't have anything like that with Birkenthal. He doesn't talk about his youth except for how his mother was devoted to him.
Yeah, you mentioned Edward Gibbon, who is a contemporary of his, but so that was going on. The history was coming up at the time. So I guess, as you're saying, the Shabtai Tzvi part, the other part is not really unique. He's collecting from other sources and putting it together. But the part that really he tells the story, as I mentioned earlier, I think that Professor Prof. Macheko used him extensively in his book, The Mixed Multitude, which it was in my Shabtai Tzvi series. I spoke to Professor Macheko, so listeners could listen to that episode or read his excellent book. But that's really, he's really the guy, so to speak, Birkenthal. He really gives us an extensive overview of the Frank movement, and then with the disputation in Lviv, Lemberg in 1759, and then their conversion to Christianity after the disputation with Reb Chaim Mackay and Rappaport, right? He really goes through that.
Yeah, he does. And some of the stuff he seems to have been, he's testifying from being an eyewitness. That is, he was there when the community in Lviv was trying to raise money to bribe certain key churchmen. He describes how that was done and how it was rejected. And at one point, they took the money and gave it to the Frankists. And he describes all of that. He describes the hall. He describes being there, in the cathedral. They charged admission. You had to buy a ticket. I forget what it was, 30 groszy or something, to get in. He describes the hall, the people there. He says they covered up the icons so as not to offend the rabbis in the cathedral. And he talks about how when he emerged from the cathedral after the end of the disputation, he was surrounded by these wealthy merchants asking, and some of them apparently correspondents for newspapers. So it's a scrum. And they're asking him questions about what happened, and he describes how he met with them and described what happened, and how they sent it off to be published in the European press, which we know from other sources it was published. So we get a real on-the-ground account of the very end of that disputation. As I say, it started much earlier. There were a whole series of preliminary questions. At that time, he was in Hungary with his brother buying wine, but they came back in time to be present for the last session, the really dramatic one.
And how does what's the end of Divrei Bina, the end of the work?
Well, the end of Divrei Bina, it kind of sputters out, but he says that the result of the disputation was the Rabbi Rappaport had triumphed, the blood libel disappeared. It was no longer Paul sort of deliberately forgot about the charge. He says Joseph II, the Austrian emperor, passed a law forbidding the accusation of blood libel. That's not the case, but there was such a decree by the Hungarian government, and maybe that's what he meant. He depicts it as a great triumph for the Jewish side, the rabbinic side, in the debate. And he, at the very end, he appends some material from Frank after he was already in Offenbach, and these famous red letters that were distributed to his followers, and he produces the text of some of them, which correspond exactly to the text that were published quite a long time ago by I've forgotten his name, but in any case, they match.
Now, as you mentioned, this a lot of Divrei Bina is discussing things until 1759. Birkenthal dies in 1805. Do we know when he wrote this work exactly? Did he revise it later?
Yeah.
Did he write it later?
Divrei Bina, he gives a date, say 1800. He finished the composition of the work. As I said, he had sent it to this Chaim Kormish, this Gevir in Lviv, to review. And we have Kormish's letter saying, I reviewed it and it's all right and all of that. But he gives a date at the very beginning of the text that he finished it in 1800. The memoirs, it's very hard to say exactly when he completed that, or if we have the end. I mean, we have a substantial chunk, but we don't have the beginning, and we probably don't have the end.
So talk about the memoirs a little bit. What, as you know, overall general picture of the memoirs, beginning, middle, end. What does it talk about?
Well, it's very hard to. At many times he says, "Achshav nachzor le'inyanenu." Now we will return to our subject, and the subject is the wine trade. So he's describing how he conducted his business, and that makes me suspect that the text we're calling the memoirs grew out of an account book. And he began to interpolate stories, things that happened to him and things that he heard. He says, and he's also imitating his father in a certain. His father was known as a great raconteur, popular among Jews and everyone else as a storyteller. And he seems to be imitating his father, and he tells stories. He tells about how someone tried to rob him and what happened. He tells about how Rabbi Rappaport got accused by a Polish nobleman of being corrupt, and how he interceded and wrote letters in Polish on Rabbi Rappaport's behalf, and goes into great detail about this. this problem. He has a long, as I said, description of the attack by bandits on the town. He has all kinds of interpolations there, his rivalries with certain families in Bolechów. He has machloikes. I found the court records, not in the memoirs, of him getting into a physical fight with a guy. He has a pipe in his hand, the other guy has something else in his hand, they're hitting each other. So the memoirs are full of stories that are interspersed between his accounts of his expeditions to purchase wine and how clever he was at doing that. In general, he thinks a lot of himself. He says he's been of great service to the Jewish people by knowing Polish. He writes petitions for many communities and individuals, and he describes all of that and how successful he was at it. So he thinks a lot. I think that what underlies the text partly is his rivalry with his brother. He had an older brother, Aryeh Leib, and Aryeh Leib was in fact a Parnas, the Nagid. He was a member of the regional council, the Vada Galil of Ruthenia. We know that from other sources. And even Birkenthal himself, when he describes a meeting with the elders of Lviv, the Parnasim, he's introduced as the younger brother of Aryeh Leib. Aryeh Leib is the celebrity, but Aryeh Leib didn't write anything, so we don't know about him very much. But there seems to be a certain rivalry. He wants to show that he was just as useful to his people, I think, as his older brother was.
Okay, so let's talk about the works. Let's just call them, the works. You sell them together, so they're together. But any other examples? You mentioned Pulaski, this famous Pole who fought in the American Revolution that he met. But what about any others? Hasidim. You mentioned that he discussed Hasidim. What does he have to say about that?
He gives us a wonderful. What happens in the course of the 18th century is a dramatic change in Jewish culture itself. That is I called it in my general book, I called it an alteration in the grammar of Jewish culture. This is Kabbalah infusing itself in every dimension of literature and practice even. And he describes that. He doesn't have this step backward. He doesn't say this is what happened, but he describes how it happened, what happened as a young. He doesn't go to a yeshiva; he goes to a bes medrash, but it's something like a very small yeshiva, and he describes when the Temdas Yamim came to his town, and how all of the young students stopped studying Gemara, stopped studying Talmud, and began to study Kabbalah, and began to have fits and mystical experiences, and they would beat themselves with rocks. And he says nobody beat themselves more than I did at that time, and he's very unhappy. Eventually, he's writing it later. So he's very unhappy with his whole development. He said that the focus on Gefat has disappeared, and people are studying Kabbalah and considering themselves great and learned people, and there's no basis for that. First, you have to know Gemara before you start with any of that, and namely Isaac Banistaroti, all of that kind of position. He's really reflecting the position of many rabbinical leaders at the time. Nodav Yehuda, for example, but many others were very unhappy with what was happening with this preoccupation of Kabbalah. At the same time, he also describes these Baalei Shem. He calls them Baalei Shem, and he depicts them as con men, straight up, just no compromise. They're just con men. They have tricks, and they play them on the ignorant population and make a lot of money. But then he says in this wonderful, I hope he's trying to be satirical, sort of Swiftian, where he says the armies of Joseph II in 72, drove out all the mazikin, all the evil spirits that gave the Baal Shem their living. And so the Baal Shem had nothing left to do, so they changed their names to Hasidim. And then he attacks the Hasidim who think too much of themselves. And he says he looked into the books of Israel Baal Shem and found that there was nothing much worthwhile in those books. So he is, he's not formally a misnagid in the sense he never mentions the bands or anything like that, but he's certainly not happy with Chassidus. There's one paragraph where he uses the word shevach, I don't know, it's 20 times or 22 times, or I don't remember exactly, but he seems to be reacting to some kind of manuscript of Shivchei Habesh and rejecting this notion that so much praise should be heaped on a person like that, implicitly.
First of all, where can listeners interested in reading more about this? Where this is in Divrei Bina or in the memoirs, the Chronis?
That's in the memoirs.
Now,
that's in the memoirs.
Additionally, does he mention, besides for the Baal Shem Tov, does he mention any specific Hasidic leaders?
Yeah, he has a passage when he goes to Hungary. He meets the person who would become the Kalavar Rebbe when he grew up, and he talks about what a good singer he was. And that's already in the published version. But what's not in the published version is he adds details about how the Kalavar Rebbe became a Rebbe, and he describes how he traveled around from town to town, gaining followers from his enthusiastic preaching or whatever, his singing, I presume, but gathering followers, and eventually established himself back in Hungary. Of course, becomes the first Hungarian Rebbe. So there is a little light there, and that he describes quite neutrally. He has respect for the Rebbe as a scholar. There's no criticism there at all.
Now, what about any other specific examples? I read through some of it, but you gave me some examples beforehand. So there's some interesting one here. You say he met some woman, Horowitz.
Oh yes, there's a person who's become nowadays a great heroine of this period of Jewish history. Her name was Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah Horowitz. Usually she's called Leah Horowitz, and she was the author of some tchinas, some elegant prayers, one of them in Hebrew and Yiddish and Aramaic. She's a very learned woman. Moshe Rossman calls her a sort of proto-feminist. But when she was a young girl, her father was the Rabbi Bolechów. And Dov Ber was tasked with going to the Rebbe on Saturday, Shabbos, and the Rebbe would give him some sugya to study. Then the Rebbe would go out for his nap, and he would sit and have to learn this passage from the Talmud. And he says, and I couldn't understand the sugyas. And so this Sarah Horowitz would come week after week and explain the Gemara to him. And this went on apparently for about a year. So here is a little glimpse of a learned young woman, of course, the child of a rabbi in a rabbinical household. She hears these things. How much she learned from text itself and how much it's just some kind of oral memory is tantalizing. We don't know. But clearly, here is a little picture of her in her youth before she wrote these tchinas that have nowadays made her quite well known.
Now, some other things over here. What about his relationship? We've discussed here and there, but we didn't go a little bit more further into that. His relationship with the Polish, whether it's noblemen or general public.
Yeah, he has, as you would expect, a kind of ambivalent relationship to his fellow residents who are not Jewish, townsmen, merchants, noblemen. He cultivates relationships with noblemen who are prospective customers. And he seems, from the way he describes it, they had conversations that were well outside of the realm of how much this wine would cost or whatever. Before this rebellion against the Russians in Poland, a nobleman warns him to get his wine out of Lviv and go back to his town because there are going to be military campaigns. He describes a priest in his town as his friend, and they seem to have had a long-standing and lively relationship with each other. He even promotes him to a rank in the church that he didn't really have. And he describes a young nobleman as a person who was a beloved comrade. So and of course, as I mentioned, he's part of the crowd of merchants who are plugged into what's happening in the world, who are not Jewish. They talk to each other about all kinds of things. So he's very much a part of society. On the other hand, and at one point he describes the election of the kind of Supreme Court in Poland, which was elected by the nobility, in the same way that he describes the elections of the elders of the Council of Four Lands, same language. So he's a certain amount of admiration. On the other hand, there's a kind of contempt. He says the partitions, first this rebellion, which was crushed, and then the partition of Poland in 1772 was punishment for the Polish state disestablishing the Vad Dalet Aratzot, the Council of Four Lands. He has other kind of disparaging things to say about Poles, drinking and that sort of thing, gambling. They waste their money on gambling, so he has a kind of you can't reduce it to one side or another in terms of his attitude. But he sees it, and he's very much Polish in the sense that he's not Ukrainian. Ukrainian is somewhere else. It's sort of a primitive area. There too, he's not consistent. But at one point, he says it's a place where people walk into the synagogue in the same clothes they were wearing in the marketplace, and he doesn't approve of that at all. He said you have to dress properly when you go in for Mincha Mar. You have to take off your ordinary clothes. And then he goes on later to say there are lots of learned scholars there, and he kind of contradicts himself. But he's clearly Polish and not Ukrainian. But he's very happy about Joseph II. The partition, he welcomes the partition. He precisely, mainly his stress on the prohibition of the blood libel. He's kind of disturbed by the attempts to reform the Kahal by Joseph II, but he proposes, he's a Galicianer, he proposes a way around this legislation by establishing courts of arbitration and collective oaths of obedience to the rabbi and the leaders that would circumvent the abolition of the authority of the Kahal. He does not understand. This is one of the tantalizing, it's so brief, it's terrible. The tolerance patent, the Edict of Toleration of Joseph II, which he issued many times for different provinces, but eventually for Galicia in 1789. And Birkenthal understands this Edict of Toleration, which said that people can practice their faith as they wish, with lots of limitations and qualifications, but nevertheless, it's an important moment. He understands it as Joseph II saying that each religion was of equivalent worth, and he can't accept that at all. You think that betrays a kind of simple-mindedness on the part of Joseph II, because of course there's only one true faith, and that's the one that he believes in. So he doesn't get it. He doesn't get the legal equality that's implicit in the decree. He thinks it's some kind of theological declaration, and that's a complete misunderstanding.
So you mentioned the Vad Arba Ratzas, the Council of the Four Lands. Just the listeners that may not be familiar, briefly, if you could describe what that organization was and then what happened here in the 18th century that Birkenthal is talking about.
Okay, what happens is in the 16th century, or somewhere around 1580, Jews of Poland who had to pay a tax to the king, a situation was created. I can't give really details based on sources, but it's very clear. Sometime around 1580, Jews began to pay that tax collectively. It was supposed to be a head tax, a capitation tax, but they began to negotiate how much they would pay with the treasury every year, every couple of years. And that is one of the underlying reasons why the leaders of each region and each major community had to get together. And at some point early on, there were 3 lands, 3 great provinces, then 4, and eventually 20-something by the 18th century. So it was to settle how much each province would pay. And that was one root of the council. Another was disputes between communities, which could not be resolved by the court of one community or another. And so a kind of supreme or appellate court was created of rabbis who would meet annually or twice a year at the great fairs in Lublin and Yaroslavl and other places, and they would adjudicate cases that had to be resolved by them, and not because there was no local court that could do that. And this was the leading rabbis of the major communities would participate in this supreme court, sort of. So that's another root of this council. And then in general, this council came to administer rules that applied to Jews in the whole Polish Commonwealth, like age of marriage, like which tractate of Talmud people should study based on what the presses were printing in Poland to protect the publishing industry in their country, rules of bankruptcy, all kinds of affairs that affected the collective, bans of excommunication against the Sabbatians, attempts to protect the Jew. They had a sort of foreign department. They attempted to defend the Jews of Prague from expulsion. They intervened in a dispute in Amsterdam over the rabbinate. So it becomes a very extensive, ramified institution, and it exists until 1764, when the Polish government said that the amount that the Jews were negotiating to pay had nothing to do with the actual number of Jews, which was quite true, and that they would carry out a census and count all the Jews, and the tax would be paid directly and not collectively anymore. So they effectively disestablished this council. There was an equivalent Lithuanian council by this time, and it also is disestablished. And it continues to exist in a certain shadowy way because they had extensive debts that had to be settled. So that took decades and never really got completely resolved. But we have, I mean, there's a tendency in some past that people like Dubnov tended to romanticize this institution, I think, too much. Parliaments, if you're familiar with what the English Parliament looked like in the 17th and 18th century, it wasn't exactly an orderly place. It didn't quite function with great effectiveness. And similarly here, and you can imagine if the main subject of discussion is which community will pay how much, that the discussion got quite intense with each community trying to pay as little as they could. Nevertheless, here we have a kind of national Jewish parliament. I made a reputation for myself in Scotland by publishing an article comparing the Scots in Poland had a similar institution called the Scots Diet, and it functioned something like this council, although they remitted taxes to Scotland. And so for a while, when I would go to Aberdeen or some other place, I'd get some very good single malt in return for telling this story.
And the Pinkas Vara Barasas was printed by Halperin, I think, some while ago. It comes up to Vara Barasas. I think, as I recall, they came down on you mentioned the Eibish's controversy. I think they came down on Rav Yosef Eibish's side, right? As
That's
far
right.
as I recall, they did.
Pretty much.
Rabbonim involved. Yeah, so it was a very important institution.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to
it's important I'm just sorry to interrupt you. It's important to say that so-called Pinkas is not the Pinkas. We do not have the Pinkas. What Halperin did was a Herculean labor of finding citations of rulings by the Council of Four Lands in hundreds and hundreds of books and put it together and called it the Pinkas. We have the Pinkas of Medinat Lita. We have the full text, but we do not have. And Birkenthal refers to seeing printed versions of the Pinkas of the Dalar, but we don't have any of that. It's lost. Halperin performed a great service, but that is not really the Pinkas.
Wow. Okay. Good to know. Thank you. Now, getting back to Birkenthal, what does he have to say about his family? What are his comments that he's?
Well, he as I said, there's a rivalry with his brother. He imitates his father. He never. Here we go again, saying things he doesn't mention. He never mentions his father's death, but his mother's death. He gives the hour of her death on his. He's around 14, and his wife. It's a second wife, but he's very devoted to his wife. They were married for I think it's 40 years or so, and I'm sure he wrote the epitaph, which also gives specific praise of her specific. Aside from the usual, he shot Snuan, the sort of thing you find on every woman's gravestone. He gives very specific details that have to do with her life, and there too he records the hour of her death, 2 hours after noon. It's extremely unusual, and I think a kind of token of the extent to which he's involved in society at large, the timekeeping, which is becoming more and more important, and in a certain way, it's kind of prestigious. It's uppity, upper class kind of thing to know. But it also indicates how devoted he was to his wife. He mentions a couple of his children, no daughters, though I'm sure he had daughters. He says at one point his wife gave birth to a child every year. So I'm sure there were a lot of children who, some of them survived. He mentions a couple. I found a few more in the archives, but he doesn't say much about them. He has one stepson. When he married this second wife, she already had a son who was lame, and he talks about him. He talks about one son who died in his the bride and the groom both died just before the wedding. But generally speaking, domestic life does not occupy hardly any space in his writings, and I haven't been able to find descendants. I thought, Birkenthal should be easy to find somebody, but I haven't found anybody. I can't explain that, but I haven't made really systematic, efforts, but I haven't found any family free beyond his children, except for one granddaughter who I assume it's either a granddaughter or a grandniece. I can't be 100% sure, who attended one of the modern Austrian Jewish schools. Except for her, I can't go beyond that third generation after him.
So one more thing that you wanted to discuss, something specific that you mentioned, and if you have any others, you mentioned others, you can mention it. He encountered an illuminated Bible.
Oh yeah. It was fascinating. He meets with all of these merchants. This was a merchant from somewhere in Germany, and he had on his shelf a very big book. And Birkenthal said, "Well, what's that?" So he takes it down, and it turns out to be this magnificent illuminated Bible. Birkenthal, you can see from the way he writes, is transported by this, by all of these colored images and whatnot. And but he has no vocabulary. for aesthetics. Everything's yafeh, 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 yafeh. He has no other word for describing it. The merchant thinks, the German merchant thinks he'll be clever. And he says, look, I'll point to a passage, because obviously it's text in Latin, or I'll point to a picture and you'll tell me what it is. What's the verse? So, of course, this is no problem for him. It's something about Jacob blessing his sons, I think. But in any case, he has no problem playing this game. The only association I had for this was an Agnon story, where he says one of the great attractions in the Buchach Medrash was an illuminated Bible that they had. So this was, this thing with visual culture and how much and what kind of role it plays in Jewish culture in Eastern Europe is vexed. On the one hand, we have these wonderful wooden synagogues, that have been preserved by photographs taken before the Second World War, and the recreation of this whole synagogue with the painted walls in the museum in Warsaw. So there is a visuality of culture, but it disappears. And my own private theory is that this has something to do with Hasidism, that Hasidism is not concerned with visual imagery, it's not concerned with any kind of Gashmias, that it's the invisible universes, the invisible world. What you can't see is that's precisely what's important. But it's not the kind of thing you can prove. But it does evanesce. We have a period of 60, 70 years where these magnificent wall paintings are created, but then it stops, and the decoration of synagogues becomes much more conventional. Birkenthal, by the way, is another thing that he never mentioned, although he's not far from Bolechów and a couple of other of these examples. He never mentions that.
Now, he writes this in Hebrew, even though he knew a lot of languages. Right. Is that interesting that he didn't do it in Yiddish? Yes. Other memoirs are in Yiddish.
Yeah. I mean, the first question is, why didn't he write in Yiddish? That's his language. What's the problem with writing? He's not writing shtutim. He's not writing a commentary on Vayikra. He's writing memoirs, and he's writing this kind of history book. So why not write in Yiddish? And he is determined. There's almost no Yiddish in either book. There's some German where he wants to explain something, and some Polish. And once, I don't know, there are not more than 5 or 6 words that you can be pretty sure that they're Yiddish words and not German words. So he's very disciplined about it. And I think that he wanted to write a sefer. He wanted this to join the bookshelf of books that ought to be preserved, that have a claim to their place there. And if he's going to do that, he has to write in Hebrew. And his Hebrew is terrific for me because it's not this melitzic, Haskalah style literature, which is almost unreadable with all of the allusions to one verse or another. It's straight out Mishnaic Hebrew. It's very clear. And so that made my life a lot easier. And it's, he writes 2 books in Hebrew. It means that you could do that. The Hebrew language was not dead in the 18th century. There is the possibility of writing such things in Hebrew. We have a couple of other analogs, as I mentioned before. So I think that it's a kind of social climbing, if you like, or an attempt to have his books considered sforim. The difference between a book and a sefer. He didn't want to write a book. He wanted to write sforim.
I would say it's not only maskilim, because the Chida, who is an exact contemporary of his, I think is a year younger, he dies a year later, the Chida, Magal Toiv, his memoirs, his travelogue is full of Melitza. Thankfully there's 2 editions now with what he's referring to, but Chida is all Melitza essentially, where Birkenthal, as you say, he's very easy to read. It's an easy read, and your notes make it even easier, especially when you have those other language or the Polish. You explain what's going on there as well. So let's talk a little about the publication history. You kind of mentioned at the beginning, but what's kind of new in your complete 2 volumes now? What was published before, and what's kind of new? Kind of why should someone buy this one?
So what was published before was most of one manuscript of the so-called memoirs, but even there he omitted the translations from Polish that he said he thought there was no reason to include. I disagree. It's part of his book. It's part of what he thought he was doing, and it has to be included. As I said, there are interesting little bits where he changes the text that he had. It's also part of a general debate with Christians over the classic, one of the main debating points between Jews and Christians going back very, very, very far is the question of the interpretation of the verse Lo Yasur Shevet MeYehuda, that Judah will not lose sovereignty, is the way the Christians interpret it. Judah will not lose sovereignty. Ad ki yavo Shiloh, and Shiloh is taken to be Jesus. So it means with the coming of Christianity, Jews don't have sovereignty. And he sets out very deliberately to refute that notion, and the translations are part of his polemic. And so I think they belong there. And of course, I found this second manuscript, which had never been published. It's about 100 pages, and it overlaps with slightly different wording, or sometimes dramatically different wording, from what Vishnitzer published. So I put that all together. I put everything in the right order. As I said, Vishnitzer got the order mixed up. And I annotated the whole thing. And that's the memoirs. Divrei Binah is different. There is a complete text. It's missing, I think, 4 or 5 pages here and there. But generally, it's a complete text in the manuscript collection of the National Library in Jerusalem. And I work with that text in Manchester, where I found the memoir text. There are about I don't remember, 14 or 16 pages from Divrei Binah, but there's no important differences between the two versions. I think at least parts of both texts are, in fact, autographs. It's Birkenthal's version. There are a few pages where it's clearly a text that he's prepared for the printer, that he wants to publish this. And we have a letter from his son-in-law to the rabbi of Lviv, asking for his haskama. He said, we're waiting for this haskama so we can publish the book. And we don't have the answer. Robert suggests that the haskama never came because the language about Christianity is too harsh, and the rabbi didn't think it was a good idea to publish it. That's speculation. But in any case, it never found its way to print. But in the sort of clean version ready for the printer, you can see the influence of his reading. There's a technical term. It's sort of a little hand pointing to an important thing in the text. He has one of those. He has asterisks. He has he imitates the printed sort of technical usages in his writing. So Divrei Binah pretty much transcribed the text, and where there are all these translations and copies from Emden and other people. I checked, of course, the original to see what he had done. In some cases, he makes interventions that are quite important. So when Tuvia Cohen, Maseh Tuvia, has a list of messiahs, he doesn't include Jesus as the false messiah. Birkenthal puts him in the list. But I had to sit, and compare each text with the original that he was working with in order to do that. And when Braver had published parts of Divrei Binah, and the parts he published were the parts about the Frankists, but he censored himself. He says, he says explicitly, I cannot publish this because it might offend the nations among whom we live. This is during the First World War. And I found out very recently that was not necessarily Bravur's idea, but the editor of Ashiloach at the time, who was Klausner, the great literary scholar. And maybe it was Klausner who, as the editor, demanded that he not publish these rather fierce anti-Christian passages. So, of course, I included everything. I wasn't afraid about that. So it's a complete text. And as I mentioned, the valuable parts of Divrei Binah are not only the parts about the Frankis, but that I think that introduction is a remarkable piece of writing, how a Jew in the 18th century saw his times, what he thought was noteworthy in his era. So it's all available now. There are 2,000 plus footnotes, plus a kind of glossary of all kinds of terms in other languages. So I hope that readers will find it useful.
Yeah, there's about a 30-page introduction. You have, as you say, you have many footnotes. You have a Milon Munachim, I think. You have a glossary in the back, and then you have, so that you have in each volume, but the index is only in the back of the second volume of Zechronis. It's about 75-page, extensive index, very useful for finding things in there. Now, was there any translations ever published of this work to other languages?
The memoir that Vishnitzer published, he published simultaneously in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. So the English version of what Vishnitzer published exists. It's available. I'm pretty sure it's online, and you can look at it. But as I said, the Hebrew, what I published, replaces that because it's much more complete and extensive and stuff.
Right. This is the complete. Now, what would you say?
And if you're willing to translate the Hebrew, I can authorize you to.
Okay, I'm not a translator, but yeah, I mean, what would you say to the listener? Which work would you say is more compelling, I guess is the word I would use? Like for someone who wants to read one, would they pick one or the other, or they're just very different works?
Look, people will come to this with such different interests. I mean, if they're interested in Chassidus, they'll look in the both books, because both have some allusions to it. If they're interested, for example, in the history of the Hebrew language, then both texts, I think, are important. If they're interested in Jews and the Polish state, I think the memoirs are particularly useful in that regard. Daily life, family life, attitudes to women, and something I haven't mentioned, and that is Jewish masculinity. What is it to be masculine? In the 18th century, my friend Danny Boyarin thinks that the limp-wristed, effeminized rabbinical personality is characteristic of the Gaulish Jew, and I think that here we have a very extensive refutation of that notion. He's much more manly, and this is long before the notion of Muskel Judentums and all of that Boyarin attacks. When somebody wants to thank him for doing a favor for them, they present him with a pair of matched pistols as a gift. I don't think that the Pnei Yoshua especially had a pair of matched pistols, but that Jews who are not the Pnei Yoshua might likely, if they were wealthy enough, might likely have such a thing.
Interesting. I realized one thing I didn't ask you. We should ask you. If you asked you like historical figures, does he? You mentioned Hasidim. What about Rabbonim? Because you mentioned the Pnei Yeshua. It got me thinking. There's a lot of Rabbonim. Chaim Cohen Rapport, he mentions. Are there other Rabbonim that he knew personally or discusses here in the work?
No, it's interesting. I mean, he's clearly a has close ties to Rapport. He comes to the house. He knows his wife. They serve him dinner. And all of that. They have a relationship. But otherwise, the only rabbis he mentions that lived 100 years or more before him. The Marsha he likes, and some other. I mean, the Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. He never mentions the Ramah. I mean, I found that sort of. I think it's conventional, but the Shulchan Aruch was written by Karo, and he doesn't give the Rama any credit. He mentions Maharshal, I think, and some other. But no, the only rabbi. Well, no, it's not true. I take it back. There are these various Horovitzes who are rabbis of Bolechów, and he has a relationship with them. His brother seems to be connected to the Bavad family in Brody. Bavad is a very prestigious, powerful family. Some of them rabbis. One of them became chief rabbi of Galicia for a year or something. So he's connected to the Bavads. They are the most powerful Jewish family in that whole region. And he quotes one of the rabbis. He quotes a little Torah from one of the rabbis of Bolechów. His brother-in-law had studied with Moshe Haggis in Amsterdam, he says. So yeah, there's some connections, but there's nothing very extensive about contemporary rabbis except for Chaim Rappaport.
Yeah, I just realized, I don't know does he mention him? Maybe I'm looking up that Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Horowitz, who is a mystical hamburger, who becomes the rabbi after Gershon David. And now, he's from Bolechów, right? He's from the same town as him. Is he from there? Was he originally? Is that where he was from? From Bolechów? I'm
not sure.
I think because you mentioned.
I doubt it.
I'm trying to remember if he was. I just heard Sruly Bornstein's shir today. He mentioned he talked about mystical hamburger for this, so it's in my mind. Okay, but as you said, the main one is Reb Chaim Rappaport. So okay, I'll put a link to it. It's available. It's Mossad Bialik in America. I don't recall if they ship, but I got a copy from Beagleisen. We should have it. I'll put a link again. People can always order it through Eliezer Brot. For those who are interested to America, so it's available that way. The final thing I'll ask you, though, Professor Hundert, is what about any further reading? You mentioned this, articles or books or anywhere else. Those interested in reading more on him, besides reading the actual works that he wrote, is there any articles or any other things you can point the listener towards?
Well, there are a couple of books about Jewish autobiography that mention him at the beginning, before there was such a thing. So Marcus, what's his name? Marcus. I forget. Alan Mintz, rest in peace. Alan Mintz has a book on Jewish autobiography, and Marcus, I forget his name, has a book on Jewish. It'd be easy to find Jewish autobiography.
I'll look it up after, and I'll put it in the shows. I'll look it up.
And then on the period, I have a general book on Jews in Poland, Lithuania in the 18th century, in English, also in Hebrew. That would give the background. People have used various parts of what he writes in various contexts, so that Israel Bartal has several articles where he mentions, especially his relationship to his descriptions of the Council of Four Lambs. That's mostly in Hebrew, although I think there's one thing in English. Moshe Rossman quotes Birkenthal in his work. The Lord's Jews, and I don't remember if it's mentioned in the Hasidism book. I don't think so. The book about the Besh. And of course, as you mentioned, the Macheko uses the material extensively.
Yeah, and for those who want to read more about that, Divrei Bina is definitely, a good read for those who listen to these Farm Chatter Shop SV series, which I did extensively. Many episodes on that. He talks a lot. Again, he's quoting from Yaakov Sasportas, but it's here, and he brings it down, and he's bringing, he's discussing the whole Frank thing. It's very in depth. So if you want to read that, you can check it out. So I'll try to put a couple of links in the show's notes for those interested. And thank you, Professor Hundert, for joining me.
Thank you.